Today we're talking about smarter communication. The idea is to save hours every day that we can use either to make our businesses more profitable or our families happier. The bottom line is we want to work efficiently with our communication tools so that ultimately we can do what's needed for the business and at the same time try and be more efficient with our time. So the way to do that is by choosing selective practices. Now, I should probably talk just for a moment about what this class is actually aimed at. It has two main audiences. The first audience is a real estate office itself. How does a real estate office communicate and operate internally to promote and practice efficient communication? The second focus is on teams themselves. So within every office, there are multiple small, medium, and large real estate teams, and those teams can benefit from adopting practices and procedures that will help them stay efficient so they can have more time for their business and their family. What this is not specifically aimed at is your communication to and from your buyers and sellers. That communication is very individual to a single person working with a client, and this communication class does not seek to either define or give advice on how to manage that communication. So the class is around how do you get an office to communicate efficiently and how do you get a team to communicate efficiently. So to that end, okay, got to figure out why I'm not switching here. There we go. To that end, we have to look at tools. So in front of you are three selections of tools. The one on the left has a lot of pipe wrenches and pipe threaders and pipe cutters. The one in the middle looks like it has a whole set of picks with a mirror, and the one on the right has a timing light, some electronic stuff, some wedges, and things like that. So clearly, if I go to the dentist and the dentist pulls out any of the tools on the left-hand picture, I'm going to be leaving before they start. I don't want them trying to get into my mouth with a pipe wrench. On the other hand, if I take my Jaguar in for service and the mechanic shows up with the center set of tools that look like dental tools, I know that it's going to cost me $1 million to get my car fixed, because imagine how slow it would be to do anything with dental picks when you're trying to change an alternator on a Jaguar. Or on the right side, you've got a beautiful collection of auto mechanic tools. But if a plumber shows up with that, I'm not sure what they would use to apply that thing that looks like a red plastic gun on the left, which is a timing light. How they would apply that to plumbing, I don't know. So the bottom line is, any craft has its specific own set of tools. And success in that craft depends on using the tools that are adapted. So in real estate, we have an abundance of tools available to us, but we don't have a lot of best practices around their use. And that is really key. Every week, or certainly nowadays, maybe every month, we see new tools arrive on the scene that do everything from aid our communication on cell phones, on computers. They link the two together. They're specialized into social for, excuse me, social for social reasons. They're social for professional reasons. There are calendaring applications, mail applications, and the list goes on and on and on. What I've got here is just a list of the few that we use here at Keller Williams in our Santa Clara Valley option. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's certainly representative of the main ones that we use every day. So selecting an application, which applications are we going to use if we're building a communication system for an office or for a real estate team? Well, some of the considerations include some brands just work better than others. Let's face it, when you compare two, seldom are they exactly the same. In other cases, some are more widely used than others. This can be an advantage because if you've got more people familiar with an application, then using it together requires less of a learning curve than if you start with something which is absolutely unknown to everyone. You also have some brands that are integrated into the Keller Williams corporate application suite. Now, if you're on this call and you're not a member of Keller Williams, no problem. I'm sure within your office, you also have communication suites that are part of your brokerage and that you're able to use them, or you're able to use other applications as you want. Some brands are easier because you're familiar with them. That's one of the biggest parts of why people choose or remain with any particular application, is because of familiarity. Some of them work more intuitively, and it depends on what the tool is. Now, quite a while ago, Alan developed a CRM for real estate that looks a lot like what Keller Williams ultimately put together. And one of the things that impressed me about Alan and his teammate who were working to start that application was, when I picked it up, it was completely intuitive to me. The way the menus were arranged, the way the application functioned, just worked from the very first second that I looked at it. And interestingly enough, later on, we find that command generated by Keller Williams is actually arranged very similarly. So nice job there, Alan. You were ahead of your day in setting up the user interface. So it's important to look at what the suite is that's used in the office, and consider that in your thinking about which ones to use and which ones not to use. In our particular office, we use, and it's KW at large, uses Gmail. Now, there are people who think Gmail is the greatest thing since buttered bread. And there's folks who look at Gmail and shake their head and go, why does it do those funny additions every time you start to type something at the beginning of an email? Why do tabs not work the way they work in every other application? And so on and so forth, and it goes on and on and on. Some brands are free, some you have to buy subscriptions for. When we're trying to cut costs right now, we in the KW Santa Clara Valley office are looking hard at where can we cut extra expenses. And some of them might include applications that have subscriptions when there are other applications that we can use that do not. Since with the COVID sheltering in place, we're finding that the disruption to our business, and as you already, I'm sure, have every one of you felt, the impact to your own business and profitability is tremendous. So the other one and the last one, it concerns some of us, not all of us, that some applications are just plain snoopy. They capture all of your information. They do things with it that you may or may not appreciate, but it is a consideration for some into which applications to choose. So let's take a look at some of the applications and how we can best benefit from understanding their use. So email was started a long time ago. I'm not going to go deeply into the history. It was part of the Advanced Research Projects Administration, which is a department underneath the federal government. It was the second priority of the internet when it was very first started, behind file transfer protocol, which was the primary reason to be able to use the internet or the ARPANET to move large amounts of data instead of by the big old tape discs that you had to pick up in a pack and you would have to send them from point A to point B. You could send them electronically, and it was a lot quicker between either government institutions or education institutions. I actually had the good fortune to work with a guy named John Davidson, who was part of the ARPANET, particularly out of Hawaii, where it was called the Aloha Net, and was one of the founders. And it was an interesting time in history. The purpose is to store and forward communication one-to-one or one-to-many. That's what we use it for today, and that was what it ended up being used for even back then. So what's it best for? It's best for written explanations. If you have to write out a long explanation that you need to disseminate out within your office or team, email is the tool. It's what it's best at, and it's what it's formulated for. It allows you to disseminate information cleanly and uniformly with a completely controlled receive list and very little chance for error in getting, for instance, someone on the distribution list that probably shouldn't have been on the distribution list. It's usually used in most practices for non-urgent communication, but that's not necessarily true. In our case, we're going to say, yeah, it's more non-urgent. We have other tools that we use that will be better for the urgent issues. So best practices. Here's the first one. We need an SLA for responses practiced across an organization. So when I was at Google, and I spent 4 years there, Alan spent time with me there as well, they had some very strict SLAs around how long you had to respond to an email if you were on the to line, and how long you had to respond if you were on the carbon copy line. So CC or to, there were specific responses. I don't think we're in a situation where we need to copy exactly what Google's SLAs were, but here's some possible guidelines. So the to line, if you look at your email, you should be able to easily work within a 24-hour response time. So that means that at least once a day, you thoroughly read your email and respond as appropriate to the inquiries and information that you're given. If you're on a CC line, no response is required. Now, this is a good one. One of the things we're trying to cut back on is chatter. And chatter is mini laps back and forth between one or multiple points that continue to generate each time another line of email that comes into your inbox. So when you do that, you can greatly increase the efficiency of your communication. So if you're on a CC line and you don't have anything necessarily to add, it's not necessary to send a response. If you do send a response, it will require every reader on that list to look at the response and click it and see what it is you said. So things like thumbs up or okay or great or please or can I have another are good from a social standpoint, but as a system used in business for email, they start to drive email into a less efficient zone. So what we should consider is perhaps limiting the number of laps by limiting the responses if we are not a prime participant in the email thread. This will save massive amounts of time and interrupts when you have to keep up on your daily email. Finally, the last is that as a best practice, short answers should be given only as required. So the idea here is to use a short answer. Long, drawn-out explanations, although interesting, are sometimes not particularly helpful. Years ago, I took a public speaking class when I was in undergraduate school, and there was an individual who used to stand in the back of the class. It was the professor, and as you would deliver an address or a speech, he would stand there in the middle of the aisle, interrupt your train of thought, and go, "So what? So what?" If you were saying something that was off target or off topic, he had no problem with interrupting you, breaking your train of thought, embarrassing you, and saying, "So what? Why are you talking about this?" In a more polite way, we can apply that to our email communication so that our answers are short and they're concise and they're clear. That cuts down on the time it takes to read them and the impact. Remember always that the impact of what you say or write is inversely proportionate to the number of words it takes to say it. Right? Think back to childhood. Your mother or your father tells you to, "Hey, go do this because it's a really good idea. And Bobby, you need to have a clean room. And your room is starting to look like, well, sort of a toxic waste zone. And you need to clean that." Okay, mom would go on like this and keep talking. And, it would be going in this ear and flying out that ear. Dad would come home and say, "Bobby, clean your room or I'm going to give you a spanking." Okay, back then we were allowed to do that. And guess what? I cleaned my room. The impact of what Dad said had very few words, but a very high impact. So think about that when you're doing communications, to keep your communications short. The second application is calendar. That was started actually in the 2000s, and the idea was to replicate what we used to call day timers. Now, unless you've been around a while, you don't know what a day timer is. And that was just a physical book with spirals that you bought every year, and it had places to book your appointments during the day and write contacts and notes down. Calendar basically was a virtual version of what was a day timer. The purpose was to coordinate meetings and events, create, replicate, manage your schedule, and it was best for coordinated one source calendaring and event use of time to set up and coordinate meetings. That's all it was there to do. So for a best practice with us using calendar, the first is to maintain a KW calendar regardless of other calendar applications you may use. That's a little controversial, but we still have problems between Outlook and Yahoo and Keller Williams' implementation of Gmail. And if you're across multiple calendars within a group or within an office, you are multiplying the opportunities for error and you're increasing the overhead for the communication. So give it some thought when you're trying to set up an efficient system for use of calendar within your office. The second is when you're using calendar, use all the fields. Put all the information the individual needs from opening the calendar invitation to attending whatever the event is. That includes the attendees, the location, the description, the time, and the conference information. Those are all really, really essential. It's really bad to start into a meeting where you're attending and you're only 10 minutes ahead of where you're supposed to be there, and you realize that there's no conference information because somebody put it on another document or another marketing communication and didn't put it in the calendar. So now you have to go back and look through all of your email, your Slack, your IMs, and try and figure out where is the actual number I got to call in on. Text is the next one. Text was originally designed also in the 1960s for one-to-one communication. Quick coordination with small content volume is the key. It's best for short burst discussions. Hey, have you arrived at the open house yet? Response, no, I haven't, but I'm en route, ETA 5 minutes. That's a perfect use of IM. Short burst type discussions. The second is for quick coordination, fits into the same model. And then finally for quick requests. Hey, can you shoot me the phone number of the owner of this property and you're sending this to your admin because for some reason it's not showing up in my records here on my phone. Quick, easy. The best practice is to keep it short and to keep it simple. It's not really made for long discussions for reasons we'll get into in a little while. Group text. This is used for a lot of purposes. It's a broadcast communication to many. Some marketing communications are done in this way. The purpose is to broadcast out an urgent or real time information or reminder. It's best for sending the same information to more than one recipient. The fact that it's mobile phone adapted makes it very attractive, and that it has a batched urgency, meaning that it can be important, but it's something that somebody doesn't have to pick up immediately like a phone call. The best practice is to use it mostly as a broadcast, to avoid it as a discussion platform. The takeaways are hard to gather if you try to do a discussion, and avoid overrun of multiple topics on the same thread. That's really important. If you start context switching within a long thread with a lot of people, you run into all kinds of efficiency problems, which we'll hit in a little while. And be sure of the thread recipient list. This is the biggest danger and why it's sometimes not as attractive as using email for the same type of dissemination and discussion. And that is because every once in a while you get a phone number of someone who's not in your contact list, you don't happen to notice it, and you're having a discussion whose context is sensitive, maybe to your business or to the strategy of your group. And now you have someone in there that is really not supposed to be party to that conversation. And you end up with creating all kinds of business and interpersonal issues. There are also instant messaging applications like Slack, which is an outgrowth of development of Glitch, which was done back in 2013. It's searchable log of all conversations and knowledge. The purpose is real-time coordination, recording of complex, multi-participant, critical path events and activities. Whoa, that's a mouthful. What does that mean? This thing was really put together to coordinate efforts. For instance, if you're trying to do let's take software engineering. If you're trying to do a release of software and you're doing a build, you have half a dozen different people involved in bringing different components of the software into a common repository and building it together so that it can be run and tested to see if the build works correctly. That's something that requires very close coordination from point to point to point of individuals with specific tasks that tend to run in a sequential fashion. So that's what Slack is really good at. It also simulates co-location. So you can be on Slack and say, hey, I'm going to lunch right now. See y'all in an hour. And then everybody knows, oh, okay, so Bob's out to lunch. And he'll be back in an hour. So I'll just hold off what I need to talk to him until he gets back. The best practices involve keeping it short. Again, remember the impact of what you say is inversely proportionate to the amount of words. Keep the members of the chat limited to the necessary people. This is particularly good with teams, to keep small teams coordinated when they're doing interlocking work. And then remember that excessive interrupts kill productivity. This is one of the main problems we're going to run into, and we'll just discuss it later in some of the examples of context switching. It is a very, very important part of working efficiently as a team. Whether you're doing software engineering or you're doing real estate, the particular subject doesn't matter. But the psychological effects of contact switching on productivity are very real. Live conference and meetings, the audio variety, we all know how audio conferences work, so I don't want to belabor the top part too much. There are some advantages over any of the written media in that it adds a personal touch to any coordination. It allows joint discussion and considerations. So conference calls are good for discussing through issues. They also allow for urgent, high emotional content communication, where being able to talk something through is much better than simply writing text. Text is a very small portion of human communication. It's much less than half. Depends on which studies you read, but it's actually the minority of what's communicated rather than the majority. Best practice, keep the conversation structured. CCO is the thing to remember: connection, content, and outcome. That's what you're after in an audio conference call. All of those are important. You've got to have the participation of the group, and you end the call when you are finished, if early. Now, this is another very unusual but completely pervasive human characteristic. People expand what they say to the time they have allotted. So when you cover the content of a meeting, let's say it's scheduled for an hour, in 20 minutes, what most groups do is they actually continue to talk for the rest of the hour because it's scheduled. But that's not efficient for communication or for running the business. So one of the things, luckily, because a lot of the folks we work with here at KWSCV are out of high tech, there is a habit that you see applied by various members, myself, Alan, and others, that say, okay, we're done with the communication. It's been 40 minutes. I'm going to give you 20 minutes of your life back. And you say, thank you, goodbye, click, you hang up. That's really important. That frees the schedule and gives us more time to be productive. So don't be afraid if the content of the meeting ends early to end the meeting early. That's totally okay. Live conferencing video, one-to-one or one-to-many, just like audio. The purpose, of course, is to insert all of the communication components that are involved with the nonverbal communication. So it's best for engaging high energy topics. Now, by high energy, that can mean conflict. It can mean something which is really urgent, or something like training that's really important. And you want to be able to have a full featured view of what the materials and the trainer are trying to present. So one of the things about conflict particularly is that it should be avoided in any of the more remote type of tools for resolution. Conflict resolution on IM, on group IM, on text, on email are a really, really bad idea. And I've got 40 years of making mistakes to back that up. They're just not the right tool. You can't resolve conflict easily. You can't see emotion in a written communication. We have emojis, which help with that now, so you can at least do a thumbs up or a smiley face or something to show that you're perhaps not as serious as the text content would indicate, but those still fall short of the goal. The biggest disadvantage right now to a lot of video conferencing is you have to be very careful with your bandwidth. If you suffer from bandwidth, it'll start cutting out the video, then it'll cut out the audio. The industry has come massive distances since the days I was at Google and in charge of that function. But it still can be a problem from time to time, so keep it in mind. So deploy it thoughtfully when you're using video conferencing and maintain situational awareness during the meeting. If you've got people who are sitting like this and they're not saying anything, that's one of the advantages of video. You can see that, and you can try to draw that person out and make the meeting more meaningful for them, or find out what's inhibiting their participation and sharing of their insights in the meeting itself. Social media, we all know about Facebook. It's been out for a while. I worked there for a period of time. The purpose is social visibility. It has expanded into being a very good platform for professional as well as personal life. It's best for not resolving high conflict situations. I've got an error in my slides here. But it does increase the high connection element of the communication. So Facebook is for going back and forth, for being able to chatter. Chatter is good on Facebook. It's not good on IM, but chatter is great in Facebook, and you can bring out all of the nuances, you can support your friends, you can encourage them, all very, very important. Yeah, this slide got mixed up, so you can just ignore the bottom part. In Facebook, the main thing is to keep the social and the business interest running so that it's relevant, it's current, and continues to be visible. Okay, LinkedIn is similar, but it's a professional platform. It was established, Alan and I both worked at LinkedIn for quite a period of time. It's a great company, and it allows us right now to have some very, very great opportunities to create personal brand recognition. So that's what it is. It's professional social media. Publishing articles of interest to buyers and sellers is really important. Alan is the master of this. If you want to see how to do it, take a look at the way Alan uses it. He uses it brilliantly for his real estate business, while at the same time, not just using it for advertising. It's really an important distinction. Even when I wasn't interested in real estate as a profession, I always read Alan's market updates for what's going on. Is it a seller's market? Is it a buyer's market? It was always really helpful. So keep in mind that that's what it's for. So keep it professional as a best practice. It's not really a direct recruiting tool anymore. It can be an indirect one. People I know have seen Alan's posting and others' postings and actually used that and said, wow, that person is so interesting. I'm actually going to start into real estate and I think I'd like to work with them. Really a nice opportunity. And create value content and regularly publish. All best practices for the social media. Okay, now we're going to transition into some of the time traps. Now this is the anecdotal part, where perhaps it can make more clear some of the assertions that I've made up above about what specific tools are good for and what they're not good for. So let's start with this one. The never-ending story is what I call this. Example of this, I actually took, this is a real example from real life. There were 5 people initially in an IM group thread. 2 more were added part of the way through. There were more than 100 entries back and forth between various individuals on that thread over a 72-hour period. Now, during that period, day and night, what you kept hearing was bing, 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 bing. 2 hours later, bing. And when you went back and picked it up, you also realized that not only were there a lot of people there and they were responding more or less around the clock, but also that the context of the discussion kept switching. So there were, at least in this particular thread, 8 non-sequential, non-related subjects covered in the same thread. So the cost of this is time. If you have 11 hours with a $200 an hour labor rate, you're looking at $2,200 is what you spent as an alternative foregone definition of cost on that IM. Now, if you don't think that information is real, start adding it up. You can use any valued amount you want. $200 an hour is what we used to use for professional mid-level people who are fully overhead, G&A, allocated prime costs. For real estate, it's going to be, what are you not doing? What calls are you not making? What contact have you not pursued today? And that becomes your cost of these kinds of threads. The next problem was there's a cost and no clear outcome and resulting action items. Or the action items have to be pulled off secondarily, put onto email separately, and then create whole new threads. And then the last for a cost is it creates something I'm going to call a vampire issue. We all know about vampires. I was scared to death of those from the first vampire movie I ever watched, and I never watch vampire movies anymore, even as an adult. A vampire sucks the blood out of whatever it is, and it keeps coming back, and it can get into your home and find you in the field and forest and in your kitchen, and it can get you, and it's horrible stuff. But vampire issues in our business they just sap all of your blood and your energy because you can't finish them. They just keep living. The communication or the issue goes through various discussions. There's no conclusion. There's no so what at the end so that we can get on with whatever the decision was that had to be made. It just keeps coming back in your life and vampires sucking the blood out of your time so that you can't drive issues to conclusion. That's really what we're trying to do. So smart communication involves quick conference call to discuss and assign actions would be better than this 7-person, 100-entry, 72-hour, 8-topic group IM. I guarantee you'll save at least 10x time by doing it that way. Follow-up emails with summary, with actions, owners, and expected, what the expectations are for completion. That last one is almost always left off. The expectation for completion is really important because how is that person that's receiving the communication going to know that they need to back up and do this now versus they can do it tomorrow while they finish their super priority today? So those communication components of actions, owners, and expected completion are really important for office and for team communication. Now here's the big so what. I put it on a table, and this is designed to show you where urgency lies within the business. Starting with email and ending with social media, you can see for the business which ones are the highest priorities. So in this list, you'll notice that live conferencing has 5 exclamation points. And the SLA, that's how long you have to respond to it, that stands for service level agreement, is it should be on-time attendance. Don't show up late, show up on time. Because every minute you spend is multiplied, wasted by the number of people who are already in the meeting. So that's a super high impact business objective. If you look back at what we said video conferencing was for, it's super high priority type activities. So that gets 5 exclamation points. Live communication through a conference call just loses 1. It's still 4 exclamation points. Again, on-time attendance to prevent wasting time is the way you make them efficient. Then as we start down from there, we have two number threes, both types of texts. Text should be seen as urgent, but not as urgent as a phone call. There has to be, the reason you do text is there's a window for buffering. Now, in this particular example, I say, okay, a 1 hour buffer. If I can't pick it up right at the moment, I guarantee you every hour as I change activities of my day, every hour I'll come back and I'll check my texts and make sure there's not something on there that's aging, that's urgent. And then one down from that is email. Email doesn't need to be looked at every hour. Email, I think, needs to be looked at every 4 to 8 hours. In this case, I said 4 because if you're on a business day, if you look at your email first thing in the morning and you look at it again at the end of the day, or maybe noon in the end of the day, or when you start the day and noon, about 4 hours apart is a good interval to take a look at your email and stay up. So that's the crux of what I'm driving at for teams and for offices, is to get this prioritization for urgency and stick to it so that we don't find ourselves using the wrong tool for the wrong amount of communication, type of communication, and urgency of the communication. Okay, among the cautionary tales, also we should talk about the trap that's too many cooks spoil the soup. So an example of this is a video call with 47 participants. Framed as a discussion call, only 11 people spoke. Complaints spun out of control because there were too many people, the video stopped working, they couldn't get their word in edgewise, and the overall effect was very negative. When the person set up this conference call, they expected that this would make the business situation better. What it did was make the business situation worse because it didn't accomplish the goal of getting everybody into the discussion. So the cost of that was morale slippage, because when people get upset and frustrated, morale just drops right off the edge of the table. It's effective discussion didn't happen, it didn't occur, and now you have a 3 to 4x problem to go back and resolve everything that was created by the bad communication choice. So the smart communication in this situation would have been to create multiple discussion calls, maybe with a maximum of only 5 people per call. So what's the advantage to that? With 5 people, it's hard to hide. Everybody can be easily polled, and if there are some who are quiet and don't come out, even Keller Williams process tells us in meetings, we are to draw out that person so that they are able to communicate fully and equally in the meeting. Everyone is prompted to participate, and you've got the time and a small enough group that there's less intimidation to speak. That would have been the smarter way to communicate this. Then what about the overall goal? Well, follow-up email with a summary of actions, owners, and expectations takes care of that. Then you can compress all of the things that came in and be able to then communicate them back with actual actions and expectations for how your business is going to change as the result of the communication. Another communication time track I'm going to call the identical triplets. I don't know if genetically that's possible. I know you can have identical twins, but in this case, we're going to expand it one and call it identical triplets. So the example here is not discriminating use between email, Slack, and IM, where there's no rules or procedures around which communication path is best for the business or the group. Again, this is not about communication with your clients. So here's what you end up having to do. You have to check 3 sources constantly for all the priorities of communication. The priority communication could come through just on Slack, or it could come through just on email, or just on IM, or maybe it comes through on IM and email, but all you use is Slack. So now you missed or have a possibility of missing it. And when you do your checks during the day for your SLAs for how long it should be between checkings for each type of media, Now you have to go across the entire suite of applications in order to be able to make sure you don't miss a critical communication. The other thing this creates is procrastination. And this is a problem with humanity. You're human, then you've got a problem with procrastination. Everybody has to fight against it. And here's what happens. You start using the tools you like, and you stop using the tools you don't like, but everybody else isn't on the same page. That's the problem. So I have distinct preferences about which of these tools I prefer to communicate on and which ones I don't. And every one of you has a preferred way to communicate. And you have, coupled right with that, just like me, your least preferred way to communicate for the reasons that you hold personally. So this is not about what we personally best identify with. It's about how do we communicate efficiently as a group, either as an office or as a real estate team. And to do that, there are some smart communications that we can do to eliminate this problem. Use the right media for the communication job. Don't use IM as a substitute for a conference call, or a conference call as a substitute for documenting an email. Take just a moment every time you communicate, especially while you're starting out, and think about what the best tool for the job is, rather than just blasting it out on the one you have at hand. The second is to stay up to date on all the channels by priority. So if there is a group conference call with an important subject, that's the priority. If you've got a communication back and forth because you're about to arrive at an open house and it's important that you coordinate, or you're coordinating inspections with people coming out to houses, IM is the right way to do it because it's urgent, it's short, and it works much better than waiting for someone to check their email. Use the right application and you get rid of this problem with the identical triplets, where you have to check all the way across the entire suite of application for every type of communication. The next one I'm going to call trimming hedges with hammers. That's also a time trap for communication. It's the wrong tool for the job. So the cost is miscommunication of emotional content or nuance. Even if you get the big parts of the emotions with the emojis, you're missing the subtle communication, which is with the nuance of how something is said. And there are tons of ways that can be done. There's actually a tribe of indigenous people in Mexico whose entire communication can be whistled, not even spoken. It's the inflection that actually communicates the meaning. So it's a human condition. There's a lot of nuance to our communication, even in a verbal communication language like the one we use. The other cost is alienation of team members, creating secondary issues that you have to go back and resolve. If I say something and I intend it to be funny, and the recipient looks at it like I'm serious, now I've created a whole new problem I've got to solve because they didn't take it like I intended it. At least when you're talking to someone face to face or in a voice call, if you say something that didn't come out right, the other person says, "What do you mean? That seems kind of insulting." You can back up and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. That's not the way I intended it. This is what I actually intended to say." And now you've got only the primary problem or issue or concept to deal with instead of creating a second one. Okay, smart communication then. Use the best application for the job, and the higher the energy of the conversation, the higher the pressure toward in-person communication. In-person, face-to-face, one-on-one is the absolute most efficient way to communicate full content on any subject from one person to another. And as you back that up through the video, auditory, then the writing, then the IMing and the mobile use, you're getting further and further away from that one-on-one communication. So keep that in mind as you're selecting which communication application to use in your business or group to communicate and to resolve any particular issue or event that you're trying to do within the group. Another communication trap is you can't buy Dilaudid at the Safeway. Now, I spent a lot of time as a guest of Club Kaiser, as I like to call it, or otherwise known as Kaiser Permanente. I have gotten to spend months at a time in the hospital as a guest of Kaiser and ran into a substance called Dilaudid, which is a synthetic opiate that makes you feel the best you can possibly feel as a human being. I've never run into anything like it. And you can't buy that at Safeway. And there's a reason. And the reason is because the stuff is addictive. Once you start it, it's almost impossible to stop by free will. You have to cut the source. So before they send you home from the hospital, they cut the source of Dilaudid a month in advance so that you can start getting used to life back the way it's supposed to be, rather than through the rose-colored glasses you've been seeing it through when you're under the influence of Dilaudid. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, because believe it or not, there are an increasing number of studies. One of them, I just cite the second source here, it's not primary source, that there are costs to using or overusing or becoming addicted to some of our tools. And IM is the one that right now is currently under the most scrutiny, and you're seeing the most articles on. But any tool can become this regardless. It can become an end to itself rather than an end to a business objective. So here's the cost. If you go out on go to Google or DuckDuckGoose, whatever you use, and type in the scary ways your phone drives addiction, anxiety, and more will shock you, and you'll see a second source article, meaning that it's not the primary research, it's a popularization of a research that actually shows that it's shortening our lives. It's doing a lot of things to us like anxiety, lack of sleep, that is actually addictive type behavior. And it's an interesting read. Now, this is not suggesting that we do away with IM or that we stop using it or we stop using it effectively as a business. It is a warning if that becomes your only way to primarily communicate with your world. You may have another problem in there. So there's also one I read recently. It was, I think, out of the New England Journal of Medicine. I could be mistaken on the source, but it was a primary source, and it showed the differences in brainwave patterns between people who were super users of IM and those who used IM only on an intermittent basis. It actually changes the way your brain physiology is working. Now, those are some pretty sci-fi type assertions, and the research is still coming out. The thing that seems to tie together is that it promotes flat file thinking rather than relational file thinking. Now, for those of us who dealt with databases all of our lives, that has a very distinct meaning. What it means for everybody, particularly real estate professionals, means that every piece of data starts being the same priority and the same hierarchy as every other piece of data. So that creating hierarchies of importance between what needs to be done first and how many steps there are to do it starts to erase. And what you get instead is point by point by point by point of everything being exactly the same priority and done on a just-in-time basis. That creates basically an inability to plan forward effectively because everything becomes same priority and is constantly just in time. The effects on productivity for context switching are well documented over the last 2 decades. And by context switching, it means when you're working on this and you're asked to do something else, it's really hard to shift gears and then shift gears back to what you were doing. Now, there are actually sports around trying to show that this is really difficult. My favorite came up, I believe, from Germany, and it's chess boxing. So here's the way it works. For 2 minutes, you sit down in the middle of a ring with boxing gloves and you play chess with your opponent. Then all of a sudden, the buzzer goes up, somebody grabs the chessboard, moves it off the boxing rink, and you duke up and you start punching and you box for 2 minutes. And then The buzzer rings again, you stop boxing, they bring the chessboard back out, they set it down, and you have to sit back down and go back to playing chess. That is really, really hard to do. Another example of this kind of pairing would be a biathlon, where you have to do cross-country skiing, which is hugely aerobic, and your chest is heaving and your heart is pounding. And then you have to lay down flat and shoot a target rifle precisely at a target while you're panting and moving around. It's a really hard thing to do. So the point here is to make a hierarchical decision about what's important and urgent, and to keep your context switching to a minimum so that you can focus on getting a job done. Otherwise, you end up with more of those vampire issues. You keep putting time on them, but they don't get resolved because they don't push forward to conclusion. So smart communication here is a disciplined use of all of our communication tools. Balance is not backwards. Just because we don't use the latest tool doesn't mean we're backwards in the way we use technology. You're only backwards in the way you use technology if you use every tool and you don't think about how you use the tool related to the outcome for your business or team. That's backwards. Smart communication, then, is a disciplined usage of the communication tools and balance. And it means that you're going to drive these vampire issues out from under your constant attention to resolution so that you can get on with the next important thing for your business. So in conclusion, these are guidelines. They aren't absolutes. You may decide to shift them around a little bit as a group or an office and be able to really determine if that is exactly what you want for your team to be able to work with. There's nothing here that's absolute, but I guarantee you that the trends are true. The second is that I hope this inspires you to take a purposeful look at the way you're using your communication tools for your business and for your team so that you get the time back. You're able to put more productive work into your business to see it grow and prosper, and you'll have more focused time with your family to spend with your kids and your loved ones and not be constantly interrupted. I hope you've enjoyed this. I think we may have a couple of minutes for